first have to just ask you what it's like to be at the center of a national controversy, because you were in the middle of law school. I think you were getting ready to graduate. You're in your last semester,
Yeah.
and you find yourself, you're talking to Tucker Carlson, you're talking to the New York Times. You're sort of in the middle of this firestorm, kind of, I think, out of nowhere. I don't think you were expecting this to be a very controversial event. So just what was your mindset like in the aftermath of all of this? What's it been like just on a day-to-day basis dealing with this while also trying to finish up law school?
It's been it's been strange. I think day to day, I'm never quite sure what to expect. So when this actually went down, when the judge showed up and there was this big ruckus, I thought, well, I think this is a big deal. I didn't think like as big of a deal as it turned out to be, but I thought it was like someone will remark upon this deal. And the day after, the campus newspaper didn't cover this, right?
Of course.
It just sort of happened, and no one cared. And I thought, wow, maybe this isn't that big of a deal after all. And then within about 48 hours, a few Twitter accounts had sort of put up a video of part of the event, and then started to get some traction. And then by the weekend, by the end of the weekend, we had the first letter from the dean of the law school, and you could tell things were sort of happening. And then things moved very quickly. First, Megyn Kelly's team found me, and they said, "We'd like to come on." And I said, "Sure." And then I ended up being on Tucker that night. Um, and even that was sort of funny. Like I showed up, they have this little studio they use down by the JCC in Palo Alto. And my friend and I went, and, I just put on a suit and showed up at the studio. And it had a bunch of other people doing hits, but they were all talking about Silicon Valley Bank, right? It was the same time Silicon Valley Bank was going on. So I was here talking about this other weird thing. And it still seemed like just not that big of a story, right? Like Silicon Valley Bank was going under, and this was going to have implications for all these people. And it seemed like this story was, even then, sort of a small story, would last about a day. And then, we go forward a few days, and federal government bailed out Silicon Valley Bank, basically. And, it turned out it wasn't that big of a deal for anybody, unless you were like an executive at Silicon Valley Bank. It turned out it wasn't going to be a big problem. And so that story has just disappeared. And this one is sort of festered, right? The deans put out like a much longer statement, and that sort of picked up people's imaginations again. We've had another judge visit us. This judge didn't get protested, but that sort of got some people interested. And so this story's had some low simmer. But the other, you said what it was like to be in the center of it. I was not sure. I also serve. I run a church. I'm a vicar at a church here, and I kind of didn't know how people would respond to it, if at all. And for several weeks, even after I did the Tucker, it's just like no one mentioned it. It's a very progressive church, right? I don't think they'd be super excited about me being on Tucker. And then some people did, right? But even that, like random people from back home have seen it, but I get the impression, most people haven't seen this at all. So it's just with each piece of it, like I did an interview with the New York Times, and it didn't come out for 2 weeks. So I just assumed, okay, they have better things to cover. But then it did come out, and then some, I got some messages from like, "Oh, I saw you in the Times," and like it was Easter Sunday, so I was doing other things. So, I didn't read the paper that day. So it's been sort of a funny experience.
It's funny when you mentioned like sitting in the room with the other guests getting ready to do their hits on Tucker. Like, are you guys, I picture a jail cell. Like, are you sitting there looking at each other like, "Hey, what are you here for? What are you here for?" Are you talking to the other guests or is it more like a job interview? Are you guys kind of keeping yourself and like planning what you're going to say?
Yeah. So the cool thing about this is, it's just like rent a studio in Palo Alto. So it's all the networks are using it. So I think I was the only one there for Tucker, but it's people doing any show, right? Any show that's happening. If they're going to a studio and they're in Palo Alto, this is apparently where they get sent. So it was very clear that everyone else there was there to talk about Silicon Valley Bank, right? And they couldn't really quite tell what to make of me. I looked a little too young, but they didn't really know. So yeah, it was. There's a little waiting area. There's a restroom, and they have a water cooler. It's pleasant.
So I think most people at this point who are listening to this know the story, or they can look it up very easily. So I don't want to get too into like the basic details, but can you just briefly, maybe for people who don't know, just explain exactly what it was that happened, from your perspective, of course.
Yeah. So how quick do you want me to be? Like
whatever feels natural for you, whatever,
okay.
However detailed you want to get.
Yeah. So I'm the president of the Stanford Federalist Society. we invite a number of speakers, and one of our speakers, the actually concluding speaker for our last quarter, was Judge Kyle Duncan. Judge Duncan's a judge on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So he came to speak. We knew a couple days in advance there would be some kind of protest, but we didn't really understand what that would be. And what that ended up being was this huge gauntlet of people as he was walking into his room that sort of chanted at him and shouted at him, and then ultimately prevented him from speaking. So took over the room, shouted him down, made it impossible for him to speak. After a significant period of time, like 15-ish minutes of this, one of the deans from Stanford stepped in and gave her own little speech about how the judge's past decisions have been harmful and, are sort of unwelcome, but then told him he was welcome to speak. And at that point, his time was about half over. He went right into a Q&A that sort of devolved quickly too. And then federal marshals took him out of the room along with me and a few other people. So, it was a debacle.
And it was, Federalist Society, all sorts of different student groups at law schools. They invite speakers onto campus all the time. This is a normal thing. This was a circuit court judge, which is one step below the Supreme Court. This is a big, even for a school like Stanford, where I'm sure you guys get a ton of high-level speakers. This is still a big deal to have someone at that level come and speak to campus. Was there a particular reason why you asked this judge to speak, other than the fact that he is a circuit court judge? Was it like, were you expecting the fact that, he said some controversial things in the past, that this is going to stir up, that this is going to cause, at least bring some attention to the event? Or were you just expecting, hey, we're going to have a circuit court judge here, that alone is cool enough?
Yeah, we invite a fair number of judges. We've actually had 2 more come since that event, and I'm grateful to them for coming, because all the judges remaining on our calendar, or many of them, got in touch with us and were like, hey, what's going on at Stanford? Do I really want to come visit? We sort of balance when we make the schedule every year. We want some judges who are people we think of as like friends of our chapter. So either people who either went to Stanford or hire clerks from Stanford really consistently, or for some other reason have a really tight relationship with our chapter. And so about half the judges we invite every year in that category. And then the other half, we try to get people we haven't heard from very much. And within that group, we look for people who have an interesting perspective. The reason why we wanted Judge Duncan is we always like to hear from people from the Fifth Circuit because it's the Fifth Circuit. So the Fifth Circuit covers Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana. All of the interesting affirmative litigation on the right tends to go through the Fifth Circuit. We live in California, that's the Ninth Circuit. All of the interesting affirmative litigation on the left tends to go through the Ninth Circuit. So we also like hearing from Ninth Circuit judges. But Fifth Circuit, it's a bit further. It's a bit remote. The judges' chambers are in Baton Rouge. That's not like an easy place to get to Stanford. So we were really happy he agreed to come visit us. And he was actually the first person we locked into the calendar this year. So we've been invited way like in May of 2022.
So you said you had expected that there were some rumblings that there were going to be protests. What do you mean by that? What were you hearing? What were you expecting?
Yeah, so I got an email. There was actually an email sent to our entire board. So presidents of the board, and it was signed by a list of students, and it said, we don't want this judge at our campus. I'm paraphrasing. We don't want this judge at our campus. We think you should move him off campus or move him onto Zoom, right? And I get this like the weekend before a Thursday event. So this guy's flying in from Baton Rouge, and apparently the demand here is sort of tell him, thanks for coming in from Baton Rouge. Let's all grab lunch. Now you can go back to your hotel room and get on a Zoom link, and we can hear your speech. So we weren't going to do that.
Sure.
And so I responded and I said, like sort of bucket one, this event will be happening, but we always have a Q&A, and you're welcome to come to that. Bucket two, based on the tone of this email, it seems like the objectionable thing is being in the judge's presence, or that his presence around. So you know where this event is, so absent yourself that day if that's going to be an issue. And I'd already been in touch with a lot of these people and said, happy to talk with anyone anytime. So happy to talk, but nobody took me up on that. And so then I met with Student Affairs on Tuesday. So again, the event was Thursday. I met with Student Affairs, and we were already having a meeting because we're planning a big conference. And just sort of appended to this meeting about the conference was, hey, what's going on Thursday? And we were all sort of in agreement that this didn't seem like it was going to be that big of a deal, right? I sort of anticipated there would be a good number of people who showed up for the event who were not there because they wanted to hear about Twitter and gun regulation, which was what the judge was there to talk about. But I thought, maybe people would have a walkout, or maybe people would ask some sort of weird questions, or maybe people would have, maybe have signs or shirts or something. But then that wasn't quite how it went. It was a lot bigger by Thursday.
And so the Federalist Society, just so we can explain to the non-legal people, it's a group of conservative and libertarian law students and lawyers and judges. This giant group that's been around for decades. That, again, like we said, they bring on speakers onto campus all the time. And we know at most law schools, even at Notre Dame, which is a Catholic law school that I went to, Federalist Society is not very popular in terms of relative to the rest of the legal law student population, because these schools tend to be more people from the left. And so you're kind of fighting an uphill battle almost every time you're bringing a speaker on. But have you ever had any type of protest with any kind of speaker before this? I know nothing that rose to this level, but anything small.
Oh yeah, I mean we have had protests before, but they've sort of been undisciplined, right? It's been something like I've described, where people would have a walkout, or we had a really weird thing my 1L year where a student kissed at a judge, and there have been some sort of weird things, but nothing like this where a group, an organized group basically took over an event. And so this is a new strange thing.
And it's funny you use the word undisciplined when you're referring to the other protests. I would use that word for this one because I listened to David Latt posted the full audio of the event. I don't know if he was the original one to post it, but that's where I listened to it. And just listening to these protesters, it sounds hyperbolic when I say you think you're listening to a room of 12-year-olds, because the way they are shouting just nonsense at him, and they start, some of the audio was hard to hear. It's hard to hear what they're reacting to, but the cackling that you hear, it really. I should share the link. I will share the link in the show notes to David Latt's audio, because there's no way of me to explain it without it sounding hyperbolic. Just the lack of any kind of rational, mature argument that they had. I mean, this wasn't a protest where they're standing there, they're holding up signs, they have reasonable arguments against him. I mean, even if they had reasonable arguments and they're disrupting the event, that violates Stanford's code, that violates just general principles of free speech. But you could at least not be embarrassed. I felt like this embarrassment listening to the audio, felt this embarrassment for them in the immaturity of how they were responding. And so you were in the room, obviously, when this was happening. What were you doing while this is all going on?
Like not a whole lot. You actually can see me in the video. I'm like in front of wherever this person's filming from. I'm in this like black leather coat. I had no idea what to do. I walked in with the judge, and then this thing, I did his introduction, and it just, you could tell it was not good. And I thought someone from the school would step in. At one point, I get up to try to wander up to the podium, and he sort of was like, "No, I got this." I go sit back down. But yeah, it was pretty ineffective.
Yeah. You could tell you're trying to just kind of power through and be professional. I didn't see this when I was in school. You saw protests, but everything that I kind of went through was reasonable. It was protests where people were standing there and they said what they wanted to say. And I never had an event get disrupted when I was in school. I never had anything like that. So I feel like I'm the old man now. I'm like, what are these kids doing? Where are they learning this? But from your perspective, where are they learning this? Because this is, we're talking about Stanford Law School, which is, most people I'm sure are aware of how prestigious it is, but it's up there with Yale and Harvard as the top law schools in the country. Training
just got number one.
I saw that. So Stanford is the number one law school officially, according to U.S. News, the number one rankings. And so you're training Supreme Court justices, you're training people for the highest levels of government, for the highest levels of corporate America, and the way that they reacted. And do you know that these were actually Stanford law students? I know some of these other events have gone disrupted. It's been outside people.
These were our students.
Did you know them? Did you know them individually before this? Like,
Some of them, yes. A lot of them, no. It's sort of a weird thing that I'm really like a 4L. I'm a
okay,
JD MBA.
okay,
I've been kind of at the business school for a bit. And the COVID pandemic really decimated our membership. The people who were 1Ls during that COVID year really didn't. If you raise your hand and you can form a community, you can have a FedSoc chapter because people sort of find fellow travelers and are sort of okay. With them, they were on Zoom for like an entire year, and so there are like two people in that 3L class, and so I was sort of brought out of storage to come be president, and I had a lot of fun doing it until this went down. But
sure,
really probably shouldn't be the president because I like wasn't really in this class, and it's sort of a weird thing. Um, but anyway, so a lot of people like I sort of know of more than I know. Like I'm like I've seen this person
right.
before, so I know that they actually go to law school here, or at least have been living in our lounge for several months. But there were only like a handful of people with whom I had real relationships.
So, like, where do you think that's learned? Again, we're talking about
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, one, something I don't think is captured in David Blatt's audio is that like it felt scary, and I don't want to sound like snowflake-ish or
sure,
weak or wimpy, because on the one hand, the people who made up this mob were not like big scary people. Like certainly, Judge Duncan is like 7 feet tall. He was much taller than any of the individual protesters. I probably had like 15 pounds on any of the protesters. Significantly larger. But there were so many of them, right? There were so many of them, and they were just so unhinged. And what started out as like cheering, it started as like middle school cheers, like "Hey, ho, ho, Duncan's got to go" or something. I mean, and then they were maybe a little edgier than that. But then we had people yelling some pretty sick things at him, and just the feel in the room was that it felt like we were coming up on some sort of sacrifice or something. It really was, uh, if you read Rene Girard, this whole thing of the mob, I think there's something that's not even learned. It's probably like an innately human thing that you can just get swept up in the mob. And I think very few of the people in that group could have told me. I think very, very few of them could have told me with any great specificity why they were there at all. And I think a good number of them who could have said something sort of
yeah.
broadly applicable, like, homophobe or racist or something like that, would have probably said that about anybody FedSoc invited. So, I think it was just this sort of thing that fed on itself. I
That's
think the underlying thing of the childishness you talked about is this is the thing now. If you do sort of activist lawyering, there's this emphasis on getting rid of respectability, right? You don't want to be respectable because this whole idea of law is going to be one of these old timey professions like being a priest or a doctor. Uh, that's exclusionary and it prevents you from being an activist, and so you should be an activist lawyer, and that means throwing a fit and
yeah.
because that's good. That shows you really are an activist. You're, with the people. You're not co-opted by these bourgeois values.
But it goes what they did goes so far beyond that because you can at least wrap your head around the argument that hey, we're trying to go around the system and we don't want to be the stodgy suit wearers, and okay, I can accept all that, but the again and there's no way I can put it to words. People just have to watch it and listen to it. The way that they're reacting and just what they're shouting just is nonsense, and they're laughing, and I think that's where you're right when you start talking about the mob mentality, because you see they're just having fun with each other at that point. I think they don't even care about what it is they're protesting or what it is they stand for. It's just it becomes fun to disrupt an event, and that's where you need the university to come in and just say, hey, you can't do this. You have to say we have certain principles, and if you want to be at this university, you have to uphold these principles, and that's where the university I think failed in the moment. I mean, was there campus security there?
No. So this was another wrinkle that in hindsight was a bigger deal than I thought it was. I got an email from Student Affairs the morning of the event, and they said, the group from Outlaw, so Outlaw was one of the constituent groups of the protest, had asked that we not have campus police present because it's threatening to them and threatens their safety. So just so you know, we're not going to have them present. But they'll be like nearby. We have to call them. And I haven't had campus security at any event this
Yeah.
year. So I thought, well, I mean, okay. I'm not sure why I'm getting this email, but that sort of became clear that this was a very bad thing. And maybe they knew something I didn't know about the scale of what was coming. And we really, really did need campus security there.
So you mentioned that the dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Stanford stood up and gave a talk. And you had mentioned to the New York Times that you had actually, before this event, had a decent relationship with her, that she had talked about wanting to bring conservatives and veterans into this idea of diversity, that she actually helped you with an event with Nadine Strawson, who actually, I want to talk about that event actually, because she was a guest on the show, and I'm a big fan of Nadine. So what kind of relationship did you have with that dean before this event?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a reasonably good relationship. There were definitely things we wanted from that relationship that didn't quite ever happen, but it was not like we have had people we've just had bad relationships with who just seem to be out to get FedSoc, and we didn't feel that way with her. We've talked about there's sort of these categories of groups at Stanford. You're either an interest group like the Anime Club, or you are an affinity group like Outlaw. And FedSoc feels very strongly it should be an affinity group, and it gets grouped in with like the Anime Club. And this has implications for like your money and sort of what you could do. And we had gone to Dean Steinbach several times and we would like to be an affinity group, and that never happened, right? So there's sort of that sort of wrinkle. We did get along reasonably well, and with this Nadine event, we knew that she was going to come for several months, and we looked for somebody who would be a good interlocutor for her. And we just had no takers. And Dean Steinbach agreed to do it, right? And so she showed up and she did it. Now, the day of the event, you could tell something weird had happened because we had publicized this event as, Nadine Strauss and Dean Steinbach. And so Dean Steinbach began her remarks, and we didn't record this or anything, but I don't think she would dispute my characterization. She began her remarks by saying, with this like big preamble, it was like, I am here today because I will come to any group, any student group, and I don't have the hubris to think that my showing up for something platforms it or gives it legitimacy. And so I just want to be very clear that my being at a FedSoc event does not mean that I think FedSoc is a legitimate group or, that I co-sign anything it believes. And it was sort of like a strange thing. Right. It was sort of a strange disclaimer to load on the front end. But regardless, she did show up. She did do the thing. We had, Adam Mortara come this past week, and we had a faculty member agree to give a response to him. And then, they agreed pretty late. Like, they agreed on, Friday to come give a response to him. But then by Sunday, they said, oh, I have a scheduling conflict. On second thought, I can't come. Right. So, I will say, Steinbach is the only person besides our advisor so far this year who has shown up and participated in it.
Yeah, and you have to give a lot of credit to that because, like you said, I mean, there's so many people say that they're on that side of the argument, but they're afraid to actually stand up and debate someone on it. So you got to give her credit for that. So then kind of you had introduced Judge Duncan. I think he had talked for a few minutes, and eventually he had asked, because he was just getting shouted down so much, he said, can some administrator from Stanford step in and handle this? So it was Dean Steinbach, the head of diversity at Stanford Law, stepped up, and she had, I guess, prepared remarks. Which, were you expecting her to have prepared remarks? Because she wasn't expected to talk at all, right?
No, I was not. And I wasn't expecting, there were 5 administrators in the room. It was not my expectation that she was going to be the one to intervene. There was maybe a bit of a clue that, as we were walking in, she said to me, Tim, if you need me, let me know. And I just sort of stared at her like, what are you talking about? Right. And she said, I have lots of training in de-escalation. I said, okay. Okay.
Right. That's ominous.
Yeah, right. So I'm not sure why she was the one. That's still sort of unclear to me. But it did seem like that was like a pre-written thing. And then she read it, and
And
went from
her
there.
statement basically, she kept saying, "Is the juice worth the squeeze?" Meaning, just the fact that he was there and causing such a commotion on campus. Was it worth him even being there and speaking? And then also kind of saying she supports anyone being there speaking. Like you said, she was kind of talking off both sides of her mouth a little bit, but basically was denouncing him being there. So I mean, that makes the entire situation awkward, right? Because then are you sort of thinking while she's talking, like, what do we do next?
Well, I just was, I thought what we need to do next was just shut this thing down. Like
Yeah.
this was clearly not going to. And I said, it felt. You hear this sort of laughing, but it felt scary. It was
Yeah.
sort of we had about 20 minutes of him being unable to speak, and the energy was rising, and so you kind of wondered what comes next, right? Like it wasn't apparent where this was going to go, and it did not de-escalate. Like that did not happen. Um, yeah, I know what to make of it.
Right. So then Judge Duncan gets up there, and I think you guys just decided, or not you guys. I think he just said, let's just try to take some Q&A at that point. And again, it really
Right.
was. Go ahead.
He was supposed to talk for half the time and then do Q&A for half the time. So we were into the Q&A half
Okay.
at that point.
Right.
There's this sort of revisionist version. It's like, oh, we could have given a speech then, but like he was supposed to Q&A. He was going to go do the Q&A. So yeah.
Yeah, and it was just kind of more of the same during the Q&A session, but it was interesting because the judge was kind of trying to give it back to some of the students, to some of the protesters. He wasn't. I guess he could have walked away, or he could have just tried to issue some very kind of political remark, but he was trying to give it back to them a little bit, and trying to rationalize with them a little bit, and just wasn't getting anywhere. I mean, how do you feel he handled it? Do you think he should have done, looking back now, should he have done it differently?
I want to actually back up to one thing. To that Steinbach speech, I think that was as much directed as at us, the Federalist
Oh,
Society, as
interesting.
at him, because we had been told earlier in the week, like on Tuesday, you can revoke the invitation. You're in the student group, and it's like, the only reason why someone can come is because they're invited by a student group. But the point being made was that if you're good community members, FedSoc, you should be very, very cautious about who you're inviting, and by implication, you shouldn't have invited this guy. And it's like, this is a Fifth Circuit judge, right?
Yeah.
Like I can think of a list of people I might have been sort of amused to invite if I were like a troll, but like we didn't invite those people, right? We invited a Fifth Circuit judge, and so it's sort of an outrage to put this on us and say, well, you're the bad actors in this community by inviting people who are not worth the squeeze, right? Like you need to
Yeah.
hear about Twitter so much, you need this guy whose presence is violence to be here.
And I hadn't heard that part. I did a lot of background on all these events. I hadn't heard that part about them telling you, oh, you can uninvite him, which to me, that's almost as insidious as the protest itself, as is the administrators coming down on you and saying, hey, we really don't want you to have this guy. And you're
Or you can move it, right? Like if you guys, it's your decision. If you want to have this off campus,
yeah,
that's fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's like there's a creepiness to that, which is now, are you saying you won't protect us if there is some violence that breaks out? Are you like, what's the entire implication of what you're trying to say in that little phrase of hey, it's up to you guys?
Well, certainly anything the administrators have to do to either enforce order or to enforce some sort of consequences later, they can turn around and point at FedSoc and say, we have to do this because these cretins in your class
Yeah.
invited this horrible man here.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I don't know if that's quite the way to back us up.
So you said that Judge Duncan eventually did have to get escorted out, because like you said, you see the videos of any of these things where you just have dozens and dozens of these protesters, and like you said, when you're in that mob mentality, who knows what people are capable of. So I don't think I think people can understand when you say that it was scary, and it makes sense that he had to be escorted out. So in the direct aftermath of that, after he gets escorted out, what do you do?
I walked out with him. So I felt a little bad. I mean, I perhaps not the most courageous thing. Like he, a guy from the community who's like a nonprofit lawyer who's a friend of his, and me, we all went out with these two marshals, and we walked out into this like alley, and the marshals put him in a car and drove off. And then I was just standing here with this guy, and it was like, okay. And then meanwhile, the mob just sort of descended on the remaining FedSoc people and like gauntleted them out and yelled at them as they were leaving. Um, the ratio was very off. I mean, it was a large number of rioters to like people there to hear about Twitter. So yeah, it was not great.
Have you heard from the other FedSoc members about, like you said, you're kind of a 4L, you're 1 foot off campus at this point, but these other students who have to be in class with these kids every day, what's kind of their interaction been?
I mean, their interactions have been pretty bad, right? Like in the immediate aftermath, one of my board members got screamed at by somebody from the riot. Was screamed at like several days later, but was like across the quad, and was told like you should resign. You should resign and take a stand about how horrible, particularly my leadership have been. Um, our 1Ls are a bit more isolated. It's sort of balkanized people, though. Either people have said, I'm really committed to being in FedSoc, and our number technically are like, people who are members have gone up, but our sort of casual people who are open to hearing the arguments, but not all bought in, have sort of dropped in a big way. There's some hostility. Another big thing, we have to pick our new board in about a week. And I hear from a lot of the underclassmen, I'm not quite sure I want to do whatever that was, right? Like if being on the board is inviting some people and having some events, I'm for it. I'm excited about it. But if being on the board is like being this lightning rod of meanness, maybe not. I'll come to the lunches. I'm not going to be on the board.
I was going to ask you that because when I was in school, the vast majority of students, they're there to get a job. They're kind of just trying to toe the line and get the best paying job they can get when they graduate. And maybe they'll join FedSoc or American Constitution Society, which is kind of the liberal version of FedSoc. And they'll go to events, they'll do this. But most people, if there were, again, I didn't go through any big controversies like that, but I think if there had been, most people would have dropped off and just been like, I'm just trying to graduate law school and get a job here. Does it seem like at Stanford now, do you feel like there's a high percentage of people who are there to be activists, or is it still kind of like the vast majority of people just don't want to get their hands dirty and
yeah, I think it depends on students. I mean, not to get too cocky about my role in this, but I think part of why this story got play was because, when Megyn Kelly called, I would go on.
Yeah.
And I'm not clerking and I'm not going to a big law firm. Right. And everyone in this seat before me, in recent memory has done those things. Yep. And so I'm not sure that they would have had this sort of burn all the bridges attitude I've had about this. Just by happenstance, right? It just happened. I happen to be the president this year, and I'm not going to a big law firm. I can't imagine, like in a new associate class, would you have a fun time if you were one of the, 40 new associates at K&E Chicago, and you show up and, you're the one who was on Tucker Carlson? I think you'd probably have a really rough go of it. So I think that is, on the right, I think people are not generally wanting to be activists. Our membership pretty much does clerking and law. Maybe they do government service, but that still is not something really compatible with this type of activism. Because we're Stanford, we have a few people who don't really properly do law, right? We have some people who go do like tech stuff, right? We have a couple of those every year within the Federalist Society. But most people are doing something pretty conventional. Now, the broader law school certainly is getting more of an orientation towards public law, activism, teaching, things like that. And, that group, I think, it turns out you can be as much of an activist as you want on the left, and you can still go to some big law firm will take you. It turns out, at Stanford, you can only be an activist on the left, barely pass, right? I mean, it turns out you cannot fail. Like if you show up a certain amount of time, you will get a passing grade. And so I know by anecdote, there are people who like do not do better than pass in anything across 3 years. and get jobs in big law. And it's sort of like, well, you might as well just spend 3 years sort of agitating. Um, maybe that's even part of what caused this, right? If you don't need to be focused on your studies, you have a lot of time to protest.
Yeah, and you say by anecdote, I've heard a bunch of those anecdotes too. And at a certain point, you have enough
Yeah.
anecdotes, you start getting data, and it does seem like
Yeah.
that's kind of the reality of things. Have
Mhm.
you talked to Judge Duncan at all since he got escorted away?
Yeah. I mean, a small group got dinner with him that evening.
Okay.
Um, and I know he was really rattled by it, less in like a personal sense,
Sure.
but more in a sort of like eschatological sense. Like,
Right.
what does this mean for the legal profession if this is Stanford Law School? And what he kept saying was, I went to a law school in Louisiana, and Stanford was supposed to be a better law school. And really hard to believe that these people are going to be the top lawyers running all the big firms, and are going to be the general counsels of the big companies, and are going to be the judges, and are going to be the elected member of the legislature. I
Uh,
mean, boy, things don't look good if that's where it's headed.
and
So,
I remember years ago, Ann Coulter was saying, they were asking her where she got the most trouble. And she said, well, actually, she says, the Ivy Leagues and the top ranked schools, usually I don't have problems with. They'll actually interact with me rationally and reasonably. She goes, it's really, it's the less prestigious schools where I have the most trouble. I haven't heard her talk about this recently, but I think probably her tune would change because we are now seeing all this happening at Stanford, and Aaron Sabarium's covering Yale. I had him on a while ago talking about Yale Law School.
I think it probably hasn't changed for the undergrads at a
Okay.
place like Stanford because the undergrad is so much bigger, and you still have to figure out what you're doing next. And they have this sort of goofy grade inflation where like everyone has like a 4.0 GPA, but some people have a 4.4 GPA.
Right.
So people are, you've all these try hard kids, so they do still make an effort. I think something very sick that's happened at Stanford Law and Yale Law. I mean, the exception is business schools, right? Like I went to Stanford Business School, the grades are sort of imaginary. Um, but the whole point of it is sort of being in relation and being social and network, so people behave. But then you have these law schools, and they combine something that's very cutthroat. There only are so many great clerkships, there only are so many great whatever. Um, the attitude is not one of collaboration with the grades are kind of fake. And then I think that sort of breeds a particular kind of toxicity. And it's sort of imagine like there are a certain number of Supreme Court clerkships, but there are like 160 people graduating from Stanford Law School. It actually turns out that like if their maximum ambition were getting an appellate clerkship, basically everybody can do that, right? And people do have enough different interests that they can do different things. So there isn't really competition, but it's set up to feel like there's competition,
Okay.
and so people are just incredibly mean, and the points are all fake.
It's almost like whose line is it anyway? I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen that show.
Yes.
uh, so it seemed like Stanford itself, after this event, had a pretty good reaction. I mean, the dean of Stanford, the law school, came out and apologized to the judge. She released this long statement,
Mm-hmm.
basically denouncing the protesters or the rioters. I mean, you could call it a riot, I guess,
Yeah.
at the point that it reached. She also said she wouldn't go after any of them individually, which I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. But how did you feel about the universities and the law school's overall response?
Yeah, I think that I mean, first I do notice that the first letter that comes out 3 days after this event is from her and the president of the university. So I'm not really sure what happens in the background, but it's sort of striking that it comes from both of them, not just her. The long statement, a really good statement, right? It's a really good piece of writing. I used to be her TA, so I know she's a really good writer. And she's really smart. But does she have the support of the faculty and of the university to actually carry this through, right? Because and carry this through to its purported endpoint. Like, do I think she has the support to have like a 1 day re-education or whatever that says they're going to do? Yeah, but that may be a completely made up thing, right? And Stanford has sort of a history, and not to go into now, but like a history of sort of catastrophic efforts at ideological inclusion. So will this actually work? I'm not sure. I think what's strikingly absent in that letter are the things that would really change this. And that would be proactive hiring of more conservative faculty and administrators. You have 6 originals on the Supreme Court. You have 1 on the faculty of Stanford Law School. That's probably a bad sign. If you were proactive in hiring a diverse faculty, an ideologically diverse faculty, students wouldn't only encounter ideas that are different from the sort of theological norm of Stanford Law School when a judge shows up. They would just have that as part of their study, and I think that would make things a lot better. Also, the administration, very overlooked. The administrators are mostly fine people, but that's not really the point. There does seem to be an ideology that was used in selecting who would be administrators of the law school, and that's probably not quite ideal. You probably want a mix of perspectives and sort of philosophical commitments.
If Stanford wanted you as a professor, would you take that job?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, but I think I would take the job, just as I can go on Tucker because I'm like, not going to a big law firm. Right. I could be a professor because I don't have a family.
Yeah.
Right. Like I could do several years of just working my ass off and basically people being mean to me. And that's what it would be. I think if you are someone at the point in your career where you actually would be in any danger of being hired by Stanford, you probably have a family, you certainly have a partner, and you're like, okay, will my partner and I have friends among the other faculty? Well, we will have one obvious friend among the other faculty. It's unfair if we'll have any more. You say, will my kids enjoy growing up here in this community? Maybe not. Do I want to spend 20 years with these people? Probably not, right? So, that's sort of a different thing.
Yeah, they talk about the golden handcuffs when it comes to getting these high-paying jobs at law firms or any high-paying job, and they refer to it in the sense of you get this high-paying job, you buy an expensive house, you buy expensive cars, and now you're stuck. You have to maintain this lifestyle and keep that high-paying job. But it's also you're handcuffed in what you can say. You're afraid to step out of line, and like you said, if you have a particular perspective, you can say whatever you want. But if you're on the right, you step slightly out of line, and now you're under this microscope. And so you're right that I think it does take people who are willing to say no to those golden handcuffs and say, I'd rather be free and take the hit financially, but have that freedom to say and do what I want to do. And that's kind of the advice when people ask me, they're thinking about going to law school and what should they be considering, what schools and financial aid and all that sort of thing. I always say, take the option that lets you be most free. And that's some combination of not going into debt and also going to a school that gives you a lot of career options. And I don't know. I don't know if I've done the right thing. I don't always think I'm a bad person to give any kind of career advice. But if someone asks you that question, how would you answer? If they're thinking about going to law school, would you just say don't do it? Is there a particular way they should be thinking about it?
I think it really depends on what they want out of life, right, and where they are in life. I think that we're much too hesitant to focus on the other things that make a good life. Like, where is your family? What do you want of your family? Are you in a relationship, right? We see a lot of relationships sort of crash and burn on 1L, right? Yeah. And so I think, who do you want to be? What do you want to be? Who are the people you love and care about? That should shape where you go to law school. If you're like me, like I was several years ago, and you're single, you can go anywhere. You might as well go to the best law school you get into, right? The debt's sort of imaginary, right? Like even assuming we actually are going to pay federal student loans at some point, there are these very generous, in theory, we'll find out next year when I try to use it, private public interest forgiveness that the law school does that are better than the federal programs. So, I mean, I think if there's a reason you want to do it and it sort of fits with what you want from life, go for it.
Awesome. Tim Rosenberger, thank you so much for talking with me. Thank you for being able to speak up. Like we said, it's not an easy thing to do. And it takes making life decisions to put yourself in that position to be able to speak openly. Anything else you want to say? Anywhere you want to direct anyone?
Sure. I mean, you can find me on Twitter, TimJRJR. I'd love to talk with anyone, particularly students who are thinking about law school. Don't just go somewhere you think you'll be safe or comfortable. Go somewhere where you can really be in the fight and make a difference. These top law schools, Stanford and Yale now being the top law schools, shape who gets tenure at law schools all across the country. They shape what happens in our courts all across the country. They shape what law is all across the country in a way that very few schools can. So come here, be in the fight, and you will find a community of great people.